In this video, I'm going to explain about working with basic modify tools. Revit software contains controls and temporary dimensions that enable you to edit elements. Additional modifying tools can be used with individual elements or any selection of elements, and these can be found under the Modify tab, which, as we look across the top of the ribbon here, we find the Modify tab in the center. When we click on this, here are the modify options that we've got. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at the move, copy, rotate, mirror and array functions, and I'll also briefly touch on the align tool here. To start off with the move and copy commands here. So if we look at this example, we want to copy these two lights across from this room into this room. So we just select our items and then we click on copy. Now we've got a couple of options here. We can use the aid of the ceiling grid that we've already got here and utilize that to snap to the next grid, such as this. Or what we can do is we can actually copy it and put a dimension in. So we put it in the direction that we want to travel. If we go upwards and we type in a figure, it will go upwards by that amount. So you need to make sure that you're in the direction of travel that you wish to go in. And then we type in the amount that we wish. As an added bonus, if you find that, if we zoom in, we can see here that we're not quite aligned to the grid, because the grid is not an exact 3 meters distance that we typed in. What we can do is we can nudge these items, and the amount that these items will nudge depends on how far that you've zoomed in. So if we're zoomed in all over here, you'll find you'll have a bigger nudge distance compared to zooming right the way in. To use the nudge command, you just need the arrow keys on your keyboard. So if I press the left arrow hit now, you can see we've got small increments of nudging. If we zoom out a bit more, and again, now as you can see, we've now gone past the line because the increment is bigger. But if we've got something this large, rather than mess around, keep on nudging and nudging, we can use the alignment tool here. So unfortunately, the alignment tool doesn't work with multiple items, so you have to do this individually. So if we click on align, we need to start off with the end place that we want, such as this grid. We want to align items to this grid, so we click on this and then we click on the item that we want aligning and it moves. Now it gives you this option to lock it. What that means is if the ceiling grid was to move and that particular line moved, the light will also follow with it, but we don't need to worry about that at this stage. And again, if we want to move this one, we need to pick where we're moving to and then which item we're moving. So that was the copy command there. If we wish to move these, again you grab it and you just click on the move. Like that. Now when we look at these and we look at either move or copy, you can see that there's in these options bar here, we've got 3 items, constrain, disjoin and multiple. And as you can see, when we're in the copy command, disjoin is not relevant, and when we're in the move command, multiple is not relevant. Now the constrain restricts the movement of cursor to horizontal or vertical or along the axis of an item that is at an angle. This keeps you from selecting a point at an angle by mistake. And obviously the constrain is default is off. Disjoin as you can see, only applies on the move only command. Breaks any connections between the elements being moved and other elements. What this means is if, for example, this was a distribution board and you've got a conduit connecting into it, if you move the item with disjoin on, the item itself will move separately. In other words, just the distribution board would move. If the disjoin is unticked, then the conduit that's attached to the distribution board will also stretch and move with it. So you can always have a play around and see how that one works. And obviously multiple, when we're in the copy command, if we were to copy this now, it only copies once and that's the end of it. But if we were to copy and click on multiple, we can continue without any further intervention. We can continue on and copy as many times as we want. If we have an item that we wish to remain in place and we don't want to move it, what we can do is we can pin it, and we find the pin command here. You'll then also get this little symbol show up to indicate that it's pinned, and if we try and move this one now, it will get an error message saying that we can't move the pinned item. To unpin it, you just simply click the unpin button. Now, in rotating an item, here, if we click on the rotate item, this blue circle in the middle is its default pivot point. So if we rotate and either use this method here by typing in an angle, you'll find that it will rotate around that pivot point. If we rotate it and use this guide that you can see swinging around as I'm moving my cursor, this will also give you a guide on the angle that you're rotating it. So you don't have to type it in, you can use this if needs be. But what if we want to move it and we don't rotate it and we don't want to use this pivot point, we want to use the corner? Well, simply we just grab it. Hang on, let's undo that. Sorry, I was halfway through a command then. We rotate it, but we move the pivot point first, and now we can rotate along that particular point. So now we've rotated it here, whereas before we rotated it in the center. There is also one further option which we can use now to rotate, which is pressing the space bar. But the space bar tends to have its own method of how it rotates. Also, when you're inserting an item, placing an item in place, you can press the space bar to put it in the right orientation straight away without having to then use the second command to rotate it. Okay, let's now look at mirroring. If we look over here and we look at these downlights that we've got in the ceiling here, and we want to mirror them and replicate them in the same location down here, we can use the mirror command. But first, before we mirror it, we need to know at which axis we want to use as our pivot point. So we want to find the halfway point. So we can draw a line, or we can use a wall or anything like this as our pivot point. But if you want to be more accurate, then what we'll need to do is just quickly draw a couple of lines, just so as we've got it right, because the walls or anything like that that you may use might not always be exactly what you want. So if we go along, find the center point and just draw a line like this, then when we come to, we need to grab these items, and now we use the mirror, pick the axis that we want now, and because we've already drawn our line and we know it's the center, we just click on that item, and there we have our lights down in this part here. Now these are still active, ready for our next command if we need to. If we don't, we just need to escape out of it, and they'll go back to the black color. Now say you want to mirror these to this location and you don't want to keep the originals. I'm just going to undo this command. So we want to effectively move them to down here, but we want to move them in the pattern that we've got. So we select them, we mirror them in the same way, but before we actually pick our axis, we just need to untick this copy button. Unticking this means that the originals will be removed. As you can see there, we've now got the lights down here and the originals have disappeared. And then the last thing that I want to talk to you in this video would be creating the linear and radial arrays. What I mean by this is if we want to copy this light fitting and go along this corridor, we can do that instead of having to place them all in manually one at a time. So if we select our light fitting that we want, and then we use here, which is the array button, if we hover over here, it'll give it an explanation on what we want to do. So we want to replicate all of those items in that place. We grab it, we copy it across, and then we tell it how many that we need. So in here, what we need to do is we'll click on the array. Make sure that if you're doing linear, that you've got the linear button selected here. This one here is the radial. You'll find that whichever one you use last, that will be highlighted. So if I used radial last, the radial will still be active. So just bear in mind that you just keep a note on any of these options when you do things, that you have got the settings right, otherwise you're just going to be repeating yourself. I'll talk about these other options in the options bar in a minute. But for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to copy this across. Now we can either, again, put it in the direction of travel that we wish and use the temporary dimensions for the distance that we want, or we can just type in the figure. Once we do that, it places the first item in situ, but then it gives us this option of how many do we want. So if we want 6 in there, we just enter 6 and then press enter, and there we have those 6 luminaires in place, set at 2 meters apart, and the line indicates that these are all part of a group. As you can see here, that it's all grouped. If we escape out of that line, that information disappears and we're left with just the items. If we wish to work on this one and move something, then what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to ungroup that one. So we just ungroup. But what that will mean, it will only ungroup this particular item. The remaining other items in the group remain still grouped. So that's a linear an array. To do an array that's at an arc, a circular, I'm just going to replicate something here. So I'm going to assume that this obstacle, this line, is a feature in the ceiling, and we want to rotate this luminaire at the same distance from the pivot point around this obstacle, and put a number of luminaires in place. So we select our item, we click on array, but now we choose the radial option. Now again, the pivot points around the luminaire, so we want to move that in this instance to the center of the circle, and then we're going to draw our array there. Now even though we've set this at this particular angle, you'll probably find that, as you can see now, it's now given us a bigger arc. So we need to, before we do anything else, we need to just correct that arc. And here it gave us 3 as a default. We can go in and change that to 4. But as you see, it alters the arc again. So just bear in mind when you do that, that you need to fix up that again. And there we now have our 4 equally spaced luminaires equally spaced around the obstacle circle in this instance. Now, I mentioned to you before about some options in the array. If I just go back and do this again and then click on array, it gives us these options here. Again, some of these works with radial and some of them works with linear. As you can see, these options change. So just going through on these to explain what these are. The group and associate. This creates a group of an array group out of the arrayed elements and can be selected any elements in the group. The number is specifies how many instances you want in the array. The move to, the second point here, specifies the distance or angle between the center. So if we're looking at this linear, we can say that this distance is based on the second item. So when we type in our number, it will be to the second item and then everyone continues. Or we can type in the final distance and say that the luminaires need to be equally spaced based on to the end point. That's what this last button is for. The constrain restricts the direction of the array to only vertical or horizontal. Obviously this only applies in the linear. The angle, when we're in the radial, specifies the angle that we want. And then the center of rotation is where we place it, but we've just done it manually in this example.